Hospital S.O. Lucas was a majestic and ancient building that stood imposingly in the center of the city. Its gray stone walls bore witness to decades of medical treatments and patient stories. During the day, the hospital was filled with doctors, nurses, and patients, but at night, it became a different place, where the silent corridors and empty rooms created an eerie atmosphere. Laura hurriedly walked through the empty hospital parking lot. Her mind was awash with worry and anxiety as she held her 7-year-old son, Ethan, in her arms. The last few hours had been a whirlwind of fear and confusion. It all started when Ethan, a healthy and lively boy, inexplicably collapsed in the living room of his home. Laura had hurriedly called an ambulance, and paramedics took him to S.O. Lucas Hospital. Doctors didn't know what was happening to him, and Laura was determined to find answers. Upon entering the hospital, Laura was greeted by a nurse on duty, whose face was pale and whose eyes revealed a long, dark night. The nurse looked at Laura with a worried expression and said in a shaky voice, "You shouldn't be here at night, ma'am. This place feels different." Laura shivered, but ignored the nurse's warning. Her only thought was Ethan's well-being. The nurse led her to a gloomy waiting room, where the anxious mother would await news. Sitting in an uncomfortable chair in the waiting room, Laura tried to calm her nerves, but anxiety consumed her. The silence of the hospital was almost palpable, broken only by the distant hum of machines and the occasional click of a shoe heel on the tiled floor. Hours passed, and Laura received no information about her son's condition. She couldn't get used to the feeling of helplessness that enveloped her. The doctors didn't say anything to her, and the nurses seemed to avoid her. Time seemed to have stopped in that dark place. Feeling restless, Laura decided to take a brief walk through the hospital's empty corridors. She knew she shouldn't, but concern for Ethan compelled her to do something. As she walked through the halls, the dim, flickering lights cast eerie shadows on the walls. It was then that Laura heard a distant sound, a soft murmur that seemed to echo through the corridors. She stopped and paid attention, trying to identify the source of the sound. It seemed to be coming from somewhere up ahead, and Laura began to follow the sound, her heart racing. As she progressed through the halls, the murmuring became more audible. It was like a constant whisper, but Laura couldn't make out the words. She wondered if perhaps it was other patients or doctors chatting somewhere, but the late hour and silence of the hospital left her intrigued. Laura continued to follow the sound, not realizing that she was moving further and further away from the waiting area and into unfamiliar hospital territory. The murmur seemed to attract her, as if an invisible force was leading her in that direction. She couldn't resist the eerie call of the mysterious sound. What would Laura find beyond those dark corridors and that enigmatic murmur? The night at St. Luke's Hospital was just beginning, and terrifying secrets awaited her discovery. Laura continued to follow the enigmatic murmur, advancing through the dark corridors of S.O. Lucas Hospital. Every step she took seemed to sink her deeper into that oppressive atmosphere. She felt as if something invisible was guiding her steps, while the mysterious sound enveloped her like an ominous veil. As she got closer to the source of the murmur, the corridors seemed to narrow and close in around her. The dim lights flickered erratically, creating dancing shadows that seemed to whisper dark secrets. The air was thick with tension, as if the hospital itself was whispering to her. Finally, Laura arrived at a half-open door, from where the murmur seemed to emanate most intensely. She hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest, but concern for her son compelled her to enter the room. What she found left her breathless. Inside the room, a group of people were gathered around a wooden table. They were hospital patients, wearing typical hospital clothes, but something was deeply wrong with them. Their eyes were empty, expressionless, and they whispered unintelligible words in a strange language. Laura hid in the shadow of the door, watching in horror what was happening. The words the patients muttered were incoherent and disturbing, as if they were reciting a profane litany. She couldn't understand the meaning, but the air was heavy with a dark aura. In the center of the group was a middle-aged man with long hair, disheveled and in an empty look. He held an ancient leather-bound book, whose yellowed pages were covered in strange inscriptions and sinister symbols. The man read the words from the book in a low voice, while the patients followed him in their unsettling murmur. Laura tried to retreat silently, but her leg bumped into a chair, making a sharp sound. The patients immediately turned towards the door, their blank eyes fixed on Laura. She felt a chill run down her spine as she ran back down the hall, her footsteps echoing behind her. As Laura walked back to the main corridors of the hospital, the ominous murmur of the patients continued to ring in her ears. She realized that she was not alone in that dark place, and that something terrible was happening in the depths of St. Luke's Hospital. Back in the waiting room, Laura was visibly shaken. She knew she needed to find out what was happening to her son and why those patients were involved in this macabre ritual. The night at the hospital was turning into a nightmare, and Laura was determined to face the unknown to save Ethan. As Laura anxiously waited for news about her son's condition, she felt the weight of mystery surrounding her. The horror story at St. Luke's Hospital was far from over, and she was about to embark on a dark and frightening journey in search of the truth. Time seemed to pass slowly as Laura remained in the waiting room at S.O. Lucas Hospital. Her heart was filled with anxiety and fear, but she knew she couldn't afford to wait indefinitely. She had to find out what was happening to her son, Ethan, and why these patients were involved in a macabre ritual. Laura decided she couldn't stay in the waiting room any longer. She had to investigate what was happening in that abandoned wing of the hospital, where patients murmured cryptic words and performed that strange ritual. With determination, she stood up and headed towards the shadowy corridors once again. As she made her way back to her son's room, Laura could feel the pressure in the air, as if the hospital was conspiring against her. She was determined not to let fear consume her and to discover the truth. Upon entering Ethan's room, Laura found her son lying on the bed, still unconscious. Doctors and nurses were busy with medical procedures around her. Ethan looked so fragile, and Laura's heart sank. She approached the bed and looked at the heart monitor next to Ethan. The monitor was silent, and a nurse looked at Laura with a grim expression. She whispered, "He passed out again. We don't know what's happening." Laura felt a chill run down her spine. That wasn't right. Ethan wasn't getting better, and no one seemed to understand why. She took her son's hand and whispered words of comfort, but the empty look in Ethan's eyes disturbed her. While Laura was absorbed in her thoughts, something unexpected happened. Ethan opened his eyes, but they were no longer empty. Instead, his eyes glowed with an unearthly intensity, emitting a reddish light that illuminated the room. Laura backed away, shocked and scared. She had never seen anything like this before. The doctors and nurses were also perplexed by what they were witnessing. Ethan began to whisper unintelligible words, the same words the patients had murmured in the ritual. The room became tense, and Ethan's heart monitor began to emit an irregular sound. Doctors tried to stabilize him, but something supernatural was happening to his son, something that was beyond medical understanding. Laura knew she couldn't just stand there while her son was in danger. She took Ethan's hand and faced him, trying to break the dark control that had imprisoned him. She whispered his name over and over, trying to get him back. And then, as if a veil had been lifted, Ethan's eyes returned to normal. He looked at his mother with confusion and fear in his eyes, as if he didn't remember what had happened. The doctors and nurses were shocked by the inexplicable turn of events. They performed additional examinations on Ethan, but were unable to find any explanation for the supernatural episode that had just occurred. As Laura held her son in her arms, she realized that something dark and supernatural was happening at St. Luke's Hospital. The events of that night were just the beginning of a terrifying nightmare that was about to unfold. She was determined to discover the truth and save her son from dark forces that threatened to consume him. The horror story at the hospital was far from over, and Laura was determined to face the unknown. Laura remained at Ethan's side, holding him tenderly, as doctors continued to perform exams and tests. The dark aura that had hovered over the room seemed to have dissipated, but Laura knew that something supernatural had happened to her son. She couldn't ignore the bright eyes and the enigmatic murmur that had taken over Ethan. After hours of fruitless examinations, the doctors approached Laura with grim expressions. They admitted they were perplexed and couldn't find an explanation for what had happened to Ethan. Her condition was stable now, but the supernatural episode was a mystery that left them baffled. Laura thanked the doctors and nurses and asked for a moment alone with her son. When everyone left the room, she looked at Ethan, who was looking at her with worried eyes. "Ethan, honey, are you okay now?" Laura asked tenderly. He nodded, but his expression was filled with confusion and fear. Mommy, I don't know what happened. It was like something took over me. Laura caressed her son's face and said lovingly, We'll get through this, Ethan. I promise I'll figure out what's going on and protect you. With renewed determination, Laura left her son's room and turned her attention to what she had discovered so far. The macabre ritual performed by the patients and the ancient book with sinister inscriptions were pieces of a dark puzzle that she needed to solve. She decided to return to the abandoned hospital wing where she first witnessed the ritual. It was there that she believed she would find the answers she was looking for. Laura walked through the hospital's silent corridors, determined to face the unknown. As she approached the abandoned ward, she felt an otherworldly presence around her, as if the hospital itself was manifesting itself in some way. Upon entering the abandoned wing, Laura came across the room where the ritual had taken place. The old book was still there, resting on the wooden table. She approached the book and examined the ominous inscriptions. Although she didn't understand the language they were written in, she could feel the dark energy emanating from them. Determined to get answers, Laura took the book and put it in her bag. She knew it was dangerous, but it was a risk she was willing to take to save her son. As she prepared to leave the room, Laura heard a soft whisper coming from somewhere in the shadows. She turned, alert, and saw the figure of the man who had led the ritual. His eyes were empty, and his voice was a cold whisper. You shouldn't have come here, Laura, he said, using her name as if he knew her. Laura backed away, her heart racing. Who are you? What did you do to my son? The man smiled sinisterly. I'm just the messenger, Laura. What happened to your son was just a prelude. What's to come will be much worse. Laura felt a chill run down her spine. She knew she was dealing with something beyond her understanding, something supernatural and evil. What do you want? She asked, her voice shaking. The man approached her, and Laura could feel the dark presence surrounding him. I want you to make a choice, Laura. A choice that will determine the fate of your son and everyone you love. Laura knew she was at a dark crossroads. She had to make a decision that would change everything. The horror story at St. Luke's Hospital was reaching its peak, and Laura was about to face the final challenge in her desperate search for the truth and her son's salvation.